Thank you to understood.org for sponsoring this video.
Carrying the mental load is exhausting. If you feel exhausted by this, you are correct.
The mental load that people are expected to carry nowadays is ridiculous for a neurotypical person. Like, everybody's stressed out.
So that was kind of one of those things of many that were obvious to my wife, and she didn't know at the time that ADHD was sort of behind a lot of that.
You just want this space to just unload everything that's happening in your brain. To me, I would be open to that too.
Oh, you have no idea what you just invited. Hello, brains. Today, we're really excited to have Laura Key. She is the host of the ADHD Aha podcast, as well as in charge of content over at understood.org, which is a website I have been obsessed with for years, and about a topic that is currently very near and dear to my heart as a new mom, which is the mental load. In other words, why I can't keep my together. For safety, a lot of times what researchers mean by a term and what we mean by this term when we use it colloquially are two different things. Colloquially generally refers to like the cognitive and emotional labor of running a household, but you could also have a heavy mental load at work, but it's more about like all the things you're trying to manage. Whereas in the research world, mental load is specifically the load on your working memory or your other executive functions, but working memory is the big one. So they're very similar, but they're not exactly the same thing. We'll explore this more in another episode, but I just want to point out it's a complicated term. It has different meanings depending on who you talk to. Right now, what we're talking about is the mental load colloquially as being the enormity of all of the things that you're trying to manage. But I wanted to get Laura's perspective on it too. So Laura, introduce yourself to our audience.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm so excited to be here, Jessica, and especially talking about this topic. It comes up all the time on the podcast that I host, ADHD Aha. ADHD Aha is a podcast that is run by a nonprofit called understood.org. Maybe you've heard of it. If not, check it out. I head up content strategy and editorial there, and I have ADHD myself, and I am a mother of two.
Oh, yeah. I'm a huge fan of understood.org, by the way. If you haven't checked that out, it's a fantastic resource for just understanding your ADHD and other learning differences a little bit better. The ADHD Aha podcast is also fantastic. I might be a little biased. I got to be on it recently. I will link to that episode in the description below so you can go check that out. I'm going to go listen to it too because I'm very tired and I don't actually remember what we talked about, but I heard it was great.
I mean, I can't even imagine, like, your mental load right now, Jessica, as a new mom, it's got to be just off the charts. I know we're going to be talking about this in general today, but I just want to say, if you just want this space to just unload everything that's happening in your brain, to me, I would be open to that too.
Oh, you have no idea what you just invited. First, I want to get everybody on the same page. So what is it that we mean when we say mental load? What are we talking about here?
When I'm talking about the mental load, I'm talking about thinking work. And let's emphasize the word work. Thinking is work, right? Like, there's a lot of thing that has to happen in order to plan your day, to figure out what you're going to do next, to remember what you're going to do. It's not the execution of the things that you need to do, which is already really hard and a lot, especially when you got lots of stuff going on, but like the thought process of what needs to happen. And the best kind of cartoon example that I have of what is the mental load is it was someone looking in the fridge and saying, hey, I can help out. I can make dinner tonight. And then saying, what's for dinner? That what's for dinner is actually the mental load that so many people are carrying around, especially often, we know, women.
Yeah. So I think this term got really popular. Colloquially, we talk about a heavy mental load, or what the mental load is, as all of the cognitive and emotional labor involved in typically running a household, right? Like managing and planning and prioritizing and keeping everybody on track. So a lot of times the stereotype is that the wife, the mom, or whatever is tracking not just her schedule, but everybody's schedule. She knows what time Jimmy needs to go to soccer practice and what time Emma needs to start practicing the piano and what time Susie needs to go to sleep. And she's also like, scheduling her doctor's appointments and her husband's doctor's appointments and stuff. And that's a huge, huge mental load, right? Like, there's a lot to manage. I think it's really important to understand that anybody with too heavy a mental load is not going to perform very well. Like, we know that it impacts our ability to get stuff done if we're also trying to hold a bunch of stuff in our heads. Like, we're not going to perform as well. But for people with ADHD, that disproportionately impacts us because we already have executive function challenges, including relative area of weakness in working memory, like impaired working memory. So if our working memory is already impaired and then we're trying to manage all of this stuff with an already impaired working memory, it's going to disproportionately impact us, right?
Right. Exactly.
Like, how do you relate to this personally? And then we'll get into like what you hear from people on your podcast, but just personally, you're a mom.
Yeah. Yeah, I am a mom. I am a mom of two. I have a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old. So there are lots of things to remember. They're both like heavily involved in extracurricular activities right now. And there's just so many things to constantly be thinking about. I'll give an example of how this has impacted me recently. And it's going to seem small, but like when you add it up times 1,000 choices that we have to make every day or things that we have to remember, it's just so much. My son is in summer camp right now. And they're doing this Junior Olympics thing on Friday of this week, which is so cute. They're going to dress up as like certain countries and whatnot, but I'm not sure if he got an assigned thing he has to wear. My husband's been really helpful this week. I'm lucky to have a partner who is so helpful. And he's been doing all of the drop-offs and pickups this week, the execution of the things that were planned, because I haven't been able to make it. I have had to come into the office every day. And so I said to him, when you drop off our son, can you please ask the coach at the camp, what is the outfit that he's supposed to wear on Friday, right? What's the outfit? And my husband forgot to do that. I'm not mad at him that he forgot to do that. He forgot. And my husband is neurotypical, but like he's doing a bunch of stuff too. And I got really, really mad because I'm like, now I have to remember to remind you again to ask about what is he going to wear on Friday? And I don't know if I need to order something on Amazon or something like that. I don't know. And so I got really, really frustrated. And here's the thing. It's so exhausting to carry all of this around. And as a person with ADHD and a woman with ADHD, it's like, it's just constantly overflowing that you just snap. I just snap sometimes. I snap during morning routines. I snap during bedtime routines because there's just too much to remember to prep for tonight or the next day and all of that. It's a big part of my life right now that I'm really coping with a lot.
Yeah, so that was the part that I found really interesting is it's not just that we're having a harder time actually managing our lives because of this heavy mental load on top of the ADHD impaired executive function that makes it even harder to manage that mental load. It's also how we react emotionally to that, right?
Yeah,
like
totally.
it is that we're being pushed to our limits and we're frustrated and we're, sometimes aware of the fact that we are failing or we are behind schedule and we snap, and then ADHD emotion dysregulation comes into play, right? Because
Totally.
now we've got these big feelings about the fact that we did just snap at our kids or we did just snap at our partners or coworkers or whatever. And now we're ruminating on that. And we've got those emotions that we're dealing with.
Yeah.
And the emotional impulsivity also makes it, so we're not only push past our capacity, but we're also more likely to react with raw emotion. We know that we're more emotionally impulsive. And then we're also more likely to have trouble regulating our emotions after the fact too, and like getting back to baseline. So it's just this kind of perfect storm, right?
I try to think about, when kids with ADHD come home from school after a long day and they fall apart, right? And they fall apart because they've been carrying around all of that thinking work and all of these executive function tasks that are so hard for them. And then they kind of collapse. And we don't really give ourselves space to do that as adults. We feel like we're not allowed to, but we're human too.
Yeah, and we do experience it. We're just not supposed to, I guess, supposed to. But there's a term for that, which I love, which is after school restraint collapse. Have you heard this term?
Yep, I've heard that term, yeah.
Yeah. I feel like we need to introduce after work restraint collapse.
I've kind of implemented that in my own life in a way, the opposite of like trying to build in strategies to give myself space to have that in a private space where I'm not hurting anybody's feelings, essentially.
You have this fabulous podcast. People come on and talk very openly about what they're struggling with. Like, what do you hear people talking about on your podcast in regards to this challenge with the mental load being a little too heavy or a lot too heavy?
Well, I should say that more often than not, I hear women talking about this. It's not that it's something that men don't struggle with, but I think that, that's part of what we're talking about here today, too. Like this is, women doing 75% of unpaid caregiving across the globe. It's not a surprise that this is a bigger challenge for women and that it could be harder for us. And what I hear very, very often, like the word, if I had to make a word bubble of all the things people are saying, it would be exhausted. An ADHD coach who came on named Emily Weinberg was talking about how she gets so exhausted by all of the choices and the thinking that need to happen during the day that she looks lazy. She's laying on the couch all the time and people think she's just not doing anything. And then she's feeling guilty about appearing to be not doing anything, but she's just trying to gather up the strength to make a choice. Maybe we'll hear a clip from her.
I have never felt that part, the analysis paralysis, so strongly as when I had my kids. their nap times were like torture for me because I think every single nap time they had, I immediately went into that analysis paralysis, exhausted, can't do anything, didn't do anything, just like spin cycle. It's like they'd go to nap when they're really little. You have no idea how much time you're going to have. So that's like your first challenge, right? Do I have 20 minutes? Do I have 40 minutes? You're exhausted. You just want to sit down for a minute. But sitting down for a minute for me meant sitting down for the remainder, but not relaxing, not taking an intentional, I'm tired, I need to do nothing while they nap, so I'm sitting here on the couch. It was not an intentional decision. It was, I would like to sit down for 5 minutes and then do something. But the 5 minutes of quote unquote rest turns into, are they going to wake up in 20 minutes? Do I have 2 hours? Do I have laundry to do? Should I do the dishes? Should I organize stuff?
I really relate to that because I'm in the thick of it right now. I've got a 5-month-old, and when she naps, I do not know if she's going to nap for 5 minutes or 20 minutes or 2 hours. And so trying to figure out, oh, okay, like I have an opportunity to get some stuff done, but then what do I do? And what do I do? That depends on how long I have to do it. Well, I don't know how long I have. And like you really get stuck. And then, yeah, you're also exhausted from dealing with all this mental and emotional labor all day. And so it's hard to think clearly. And then here's another thing that ADHD makes a little bit difficult. We know that ADHD impacts sleep. A lot of
Yes.
adults with ADHD have sleep disorders as well. I personally have restless leg syndrome. A lot of people have delayed sleep phase syndrome. There's sleep apnea is really common with ADHD. There's a lot of sleep difficulties. But then on top of that, if you have a really heavy mental load, when you go to sleep at the end of the night and you realize like how much stuff you haven't gotten done, or you're trying to get ahead on essentially this mental and emotional labor for tomorrow, and you're thinking through, okay, what do I need to do tomorrow? What's going to happen? Like, what's my schedule like? You're now doing more work as soon as you try to go to sleep, or you're trying to catch up, right? You're like, oh shoot, I actually forgot to, pack the lunches and I didn't do this. And so you're using this time that you need to be sleeping to get caught up on all the balls that you dropped, right? And then you don't get enough sleep. And then tomorrow's even harder. The mental load, we talk about it a lot when it comes to women, but if you have ADHD, it can impact you regardless. I will say my partner has been really great too in helping with the baby and stuff, but the set shifting has been really tough. We're both out of our normal routines. And so there's a heavier mental load when you're essentially in what I call manual mode, where nothing's automatic. You're having to think through every step of your day because you're out of your normal routines. And so that's already a heavy mental load. And then set shifting, having to adjust on dime, right? And so it's weird how it comes into play, because I will say, like, oh, shoot, I forgot about this. Hey, babe, can you do this? And now he has to do extra mental work of adjusting to what now needs to happen when he already had, he had done the mental and emotional work of like, okay, cool, I'm going to go do this thing. And then I threw him off track. So now he has to do something else. And we can kind of inadvertently like create more mental work for each other. So I want to
Right.
say, like, it's not unique to women to have that extra mental load. It
Absolutely
often
not,
shows
yeah.
up differently. So there are a couple of places that ADHD memory tends to be impaired, working memory and perspective memory. And both of those have a lot to do with this, because working memory is the primary thing that the mental load is heavy on, right? We're having to like hold things in our head while we work with it. But also perspective memory. This is something that's new for a lot of people. I know Jesse J. Anderson was on your podcast talking about this.
And let's hear from Jesse. Yeah.
So that was kind of one of those things of many that were obvious to my wife, and she didn't know at the time that ADHD was sort of behind a lot of that. I didn't know that I had any memory issues before I got diagnosed. Like, I knew that I struggled with time. I knew I had like difficulties with anger, and I knew that I was distracted by things. I didn't know it was ADHD, but I kind of knew about those things. But the memory, I had no idea that I had a problem with memory.
I think that just as humans in general, we take for granted how many choices we have to make every single day. The human brain wants to be efficient. It wants to be as efficient as possible. But we're already at this depth. We have this deficit as people with ADHD, men and women, right, who are struggling with executive functioning. To your point, this is a working memory issue, this idea of like managing the mental load. And then metacognition, this close relative of executive functioning that's all about, remembering to remember, thinking about thinking, planning to plan. Like, I'm thinking of the movie Office Space right now. They're like planning to plan in the background. But yeah, and it's exhausting to that point, we're talking about the kid coming home from the end at school at the end of the day, falling apart. We do this too as adults. Of course we do, right? It makes sense. Our brain is on overdrive and trying to do extra, do more. And it is a lot of things happening that people just don't even realize underneath the surface.
Yeah, and I think another huge part of it here is that we're trying to hold ourselves to neurotypical standards because the world tells us that that's what we're supposed to be able to do. And because we can maybe do it sometimes, we expect that of ourselves too, right? There's so many things that can make us have good brain days or bad brain days, but we're holding ourselves to these really unrealistic standards. At least they're unrealistic to hit them consistently, right?
Totally. And I don't know about you, Jessica, but for me, like, this is where perfectionism often comes in, like trying to live up to these neurotypical standards. And this is where self-awareness can be really painful, right? If you've worked hard to have self-awareness of what you're struggling with and you know that you're working on it, you also know that you're struggling with it and you want to do it perfectly, right? There's this little voice in your head that's like, no, I don't want to inconvenience anybody, and I don't want to be a burden, and I can do this just as well as somebody else. This is something that Mallory Band talked about in her interview on ADHD Aha.
Making any type of mistake, that just like wasn't an option ever. Not because that's what my parents said. I was actually putting these expectations on for myself. You had to be perfect. And if you weren't, well, bad things were going to happen. Someone's going to find out and someone's going to figure out other characteristics about you of, oh, you're not perfect. And you're really annoying because you don't ever stop talking and you don't know how to take turns in a conversation. And your leg's always bouncing. And you often have really big reactions to things. It just depended on what it was. But then it was sort of a domino effect where one thing led to another. And I didn't want to be exposed as here were some traits that were maybe different, or that I guess rather I wasn't really comfortable with or didn't understand that, like, in the ADHD world, that's really normal.
I love that. I love the end of that quote. In the ADHD world, that's really normal. It is completely normal to be struggling with this stuff when you have ADHD. It would actually be weird if we didn't. The mental load that people are expected to carry nowadays is ridiculous for a neurotypical person. Like, everybody's stressed out. Like, a lot of people are burning out. This is too heavy a mental load for most people. But if you have ADHD, of course you're going to struggle.
What's the question that people ask you most often when they know that you're struggling and they want to help you?
How can I help, right? And then that's more work.
It's more work for you. Exactly. I was talking with somebody on the team recently and they suggested, you can ask somebody, yes, I actually do need help, but can you give me a choice of what you could do to help? Would you rather answer a multiple choice question, or would you rather write, a short form essay to answer a question when you're kind of under duress, when you're stressed out? So like the example I had talked about earlier with like the dinner and the cartoon, it's like if that person had said, okay, I'll help out. I'm going to make dinner tonight. Do you want spaghetti or do you want tacos? Imagine how much easier that is to cope with as the person who has to, like, who's been bearing that mental load. People often are like, oh, let me know however I can help. And they're just trying, that's just a nice thing that you say. But if it's somebody who you trust and you really like, I really do need your help, but I need you to give me options.
No, that's great. And because advocating for yourself and saying this is what I need, because a lot of times it's really easy to say like, no, it's fine. Like I'll handle it, because it is more work. It is more mental work on top of your already crushing mental load to try and come up with the things that you need to help yourself. So it's easier to just say, no, I'm fine. I'll take care of it. But being able to say, yes, I do need help. Can you give me choices? And not like 50 choices. Like, can you give me a couple of choices?
Yeah. Give me an A or give me a true false test. Yeah. And like a lot of times, Jessica, where my emotional dysregulation comes in is when I get asked that question. And it's like it's asked with the best of intentions, like a lot of kindness. It's people truly mean it. Like, I want to help you. How can I help you? And my reaction is, I don't know. And that's where the crying comes in. It's kind of like when you're trying to hold back tears and then somebody gives you a hug and then that's when you start crying. It's really hard to regulate at that moment, because I'm like, I do need help and I don't even know what I need because I can't think about it.
What else can we do to lighten our mental load?
I think externalizing as much as possible. There are different ways that you can externalize. What I mean by that is like literally the act of writing down what's in your brain is one kind of, standard example of that, writing it all down and seeing, is there anything that we can offload, that like even the thinking power that's around that? It's kind of a boring example, but having like a whiteboard in your house where you write down things so that you don't have to remember it in your brain.
Yeah, the whiteboard is a very common example. I'm sure people have talked about this on your podcast.
Yeah, Jesse Anderson talked about it, and he had a great example of like chores and like how they manage all of their family's, mental load on a whiteboard, or as much of it as they possibly could, right? So there's this other way of externalizing things that I do that my husband kind of makes fun of me for in a loving way. Everybody always says, lay out the clothes that you want to put out, you want to wear the next day. That helps you avoid having to make that choice and whatnot. Get the bags ready. Yes to all of that. There's something else that I do that saves me absolutely zero time when it comes to execution, but it is a comfort to my soul and to my brain, to my ADHD brain, which is I just move objects from one place to another to the place where I know I'm going to look in the morning. It's like my kids' vitamins, right? Every morning they have to take them, but I won't remember if I don't put it on the dining table and take it away from where they are now, like by the toaster. I'll just forget. And I always say to my husband, I'm like, hey, can you set up for the morning? And I'm like, but you didn't put out the vitamins. He's like, they're right there. There's nothing to prep. And I'm like, but I won't remember them unless they're right there on the table. Right. So it's like this object thing. Like sometimes if I'm having trouble falling asleep and I'm like, I don't want to have to carry this thought anymore, I will take like a bobby pin out of my hair and I'll put it on my nightstand and be like, that bobby pin means that I need to schedule a haircut tomorrow. And that allows me to fall asleep. Because it's like this weird trick. I don't know if that would work for everybody, but it works for me.
I mean, nothing. Let's be real. Nothing works for everybody with ADHD.
Yeah.
Even things that work for us one day are not necessarily always going to work the next. But visual cues are really powerful.
Yes,
so
exactly.
Next time your husband's like, "There's nothing to prep," the visual cue is what needed prepping. The weirder, the better. Too. Sometimes Dr. Patrick LeCount, who's a researcher that we work with a lot, have worked with for years, and is a mental health professional that reviews all the videos on our channel. If anybody's wondering why we had that like blue banner, Dr. Patrick LeCount has a great strategy for laundry. He puts a sock on the doorknob, like on the way out, so that he will remember to change the laundry before he leaves.
I need to do that. How much I have so many, like my washing machine is so disgusting because of all of the wet laundry I've left in there overnight on multiple occasions.
One of my big strategies is, and this is definitely not something that works for everybody, but have less stuff to manage. That's also a way to reduce the mental load, is to just not be doing as much. And that doesn't mean we're not going to accomplish as much, just not be trying to do as much at the same time. There's a saying that I really love in the ADHD community: if you want to do more, do less. And it's because if we're carrying this enormous mental load of all the things that we want to do, the possibility that we'll actually get to all of it, not great, right? And so if we just deliberately get some stuff off our mental plate ahead of time, that frees up some mental bandwidth to actually get the things done. And then we can always add stuff back onto our plate. And a way that I really love doing this is you have your to-do list that's like your wish list, like all the stuff I'd like to do, but then you have another to-do list that's the stuff you're actually going to do, so that you're not cluttering up your brain with all of the things. It's just, you just have to focus on the things that you want to do. And I'm not really great at actually writing out to-do lists for myself, but I'll do a mental list, which is probably not great for the mental load, but I can't find pens ever, paper. So then another issue, I've got to solve that problem, but that's not today's problem. Today, what I do is like 3 things. Like, what 3 things, if I get those things done, will I consider today a success? Yeah. And I got that from Dr. Patrick LeCount.
I love that.
And it's game changing, right? Because now you've defined success by a measure that is actually doable, right? And then anything else is a bonus.
Do you know what kinds of things kind of always seep in and really distract me and amplify my mental load, but there's nothing productive about it, are the things that I'm like, oh, next year I need to remember to make sure that I schedule this kind of appointment for my child. But it's not something I can do for a year.
Yeah.
Right?
It's not something you can take action on yet.
Right. There's nothing actionable about it, and it just takes up so much space in my brain. And like I've started to do this thing where I will like set a date in the future in my Google Calendar and just be like, okay, and I will invite my husband to it and just be like, okay, talk about X on January, 31st of 2028 or whatever. So hopefully we're all still using like Google Calendars by then, or else all of these thoughts will be lost.
I suspect so, yeah. But yeah, that's a great way to do it too. I've done that about big things that I'm worried about. Before, I remember thinking about like, oh, I want to have kids, but like I wouldn't even be with anybody. And I'm like, okay, I'm not in a place to have kids right now, so this shouldn't be taking up mental space. So I would just set a date on my calendar in the future. I'm like, think about whether or not I want to have kids, or maybe freeze my eggs, right? And like you put it in the future, because I'm so scared. And I think this is one of the reasons why we hold so much in our heads. I'm so scared I'm going to forget. And so my brain keeps reminding me like, oh, don't forget about this. Don't forget about this. Don't forget about this, because I don't have, don't always have these trusted systems. But if you do have a trusted system that can remind you, it's a good way to like get your brain to stop popping up this alert, hopefully. One of my favorite strategies is if you need help, rather than delegating single tasks, because you're still carrying the mental load for that, right? You still have to think about like, what is it he needs to do? Ask him to do it. Follow up on whether or not he did it. It's actually sometimes a heavier mental load than if you just do it yourself. And that's a lot of what we come to, right? It's like, it would have been easier if I just did it myself. That is true for a lot of individual tasks, right? But if you delegate an entire area of responsibility, now you're not just delegating the execution of that task, you're delegating the mental labor. Rather than saying, hey, could you empty the dishwasher? You can say, hey, can you be in charge of the dishes, right? So you don't have to think about like what dishes need to be done. Has the dishwasher been run? Does it need to be emptied? Did they actually empty? Like you don't have to think about it. And so we actually just started doing a system called Fair Play, and we'll link to that in the description. There's a great book about it. It is highly gendered. It assumes that you are the beleaguered woman in the relationship that's been doing way too much. You can skip past that part if you're already on board. Like, yes, I would like to divide up chores and tasks in my home in a way that's equitable. You can just skip to the part of the book that talks about what the cards are, how to do it. But there's a book, and then there's this card deck. And I love it because you have all of these cards that represent areas of responsibility in your home. So dishes, laundry, tidying and organizing, pet care, all of these things, right? And you divide up the cards so that you're each getting an equitable amount of cards. And then you are responsible for, she calls it CPE, so conception, planning, and execution of these tasks. So it's not like you're responsible for conceiving and planning, and then you ask your partner to help with the execution, because then what happens is what happened with your husband. They don't have context for the situation. They just know this random task came at them out of nowhere, and like they were supposed to do it, but then they forgot to do it, and now like they feel bad, you're frustrated. It is game changing. So there are areas of my life that I don't even have to think about, because that's my partner's job, and he's got the card. But let's say you did snap at your kids. Let's say you did emotionally spiral out, and now you're at work and you're ruminating and beating yourself up over stuff. Like, do you have any strategies for regulating our emotions when they do get the best of us?
I mean, this is the hardest part, right? Because there's so much that we can do to avoid triggers. But like in the moment itself, when you are in the middle of that emotional kind of, I don't know if I like the word spiral, because it sounds so like submissive. I don't know, to be part of that, but you know what I mean? Like you're in the middle of like this rumination, to your point. It's so hard to get out of it. It takes a lot of practice to treat yourself the way that you treat other people, and to be kind to yourself. Like, can you be Robin Williams in Good Will Hunting to yourself, I guess, is a question that I would ask. Like, can you say to yourself, like, it's not my fault and this happened, and we are going to move on, and we're going to cope from this. It's not worth my energy right now to just keep going and keep going and keep going, right? Something that I often do when I get in these moments is like, I get so fixated on what I snapped, and then the fact that now this moment is ruined, and now the fact that like, how do I stop this? How can I erase this? I just want to erase that this happened, because now I've ruined the day. You didn't ruin the day. You can't erase it. I know that sleep is really hard for people with ADHD, and like it's all part and parcel of all of this. Whatever you can do to get to bed, the effect of like the physical body on our emotional health and our emotional well-being, to your point, like if you don't get enough sleep, it's just going to be worse tomorrow. Maybe you'll feel equally bad tomorrow, but without the sleep, you will feel even worse.
Yeah, I feel like without the sleep, we're more likely to lose it or snap, and it's harder to regulate our emotions afterwards. So yeah, prioritizing sleep, that actually makes a lot of sense. There's something I like to say, which is if it looks like the entire world is on fire, get your face out of the candle. Sometimes you're just a little too close to it and you kind of need to step back and get a little perspective. Like, okay, this was one moment in an entire day. Did I actually ruin everything?
Yeah. And you talk about this all the time. I think there's a misconception about people with ADHD. People might think like people with ADHD are just being lazy or they're not trying very hard. I think that we try so hard, especially when you're self-aware and you know what you're struggling with. So like to your point earlier, Jess, about, can you do fewer things? Can you set lower standards for yourself? I know that sounds weird if you take it out of context, but can you just be okay with the fact that you're going to lose it sometimes? I mean, maybe it's just going to happen.
It's unrealistic to expect yourself to manage your symptoms perfectly.
Yeah.
Our executive function challenges make it harder for us to use the strategies that we need to use. So it's not realistic. It's not realistic to be perfect at anything. And that includes managing our symptoms.
I think that by like lowering the standards of what we expect in terms of our own emotional regulation, sometimes that eventually it will lead to more emotional regulation, right? Because like that, it's that gripping, right, of trying to do it all perfectly that I think sometimes leads to the explosion. A big breakthrough moment for me as a parent, getting so frustrated in the morning and at night with my kids and being like, why won't you just do the routine the way you're supposed to be doing it? I had this realization through my therapist, and I took my husband aside into a corner, like we were telling like some amazing secret. And I was like, they're not supposed to be well behaved. They're kids.
Mm-hmm.
Like having that realization, it just totally flipped the script. And I was like magically a little bit more patient. And if you can do that with yourself too, that's amazing.
Trying to control what can't be controlled is part of what puts us on edge, is part of what's going to make us not only carry a heavier mental load than we need to, but also make it harder for us to emotionally regulate. This is amazing. There is so much good stuff. I'm excited to listen to more of your podcast. If people want to listen to the ADHD Aha podcast, we will put the link in the description below, also probably a pinned comment. Let us know in the comments below what is making your mental load so heavy and what strategies, if any, you have found to lighten your mental load, even if you do have a lot to manage. How do you make it so that it's not all sitting on your brain at once? Let's normalize this and talk about it and support each other with strategies and empathy, I think, is the big one. Is there anything you want people to take away from this? Like, if nothing else, like, is there one takeaway that you hope that people get from this?
Carrying the mental load is exhausting. If you feel exhausted by this, you are correct, is what I will say. There's nothing wrong with you. If you have ADHD and you are like, why am I falling apart? Why am I so exhausted by making decisions, by thinking, by planning, by remembering? Correct. It makes sense.
I feel like you just graded our paper. Like, correct. Yes.
And be kind and let yourself know that is what happens when you have ADHD. It's part of it. It's not your fault. And we can cope with this.
I love it. We'll be exploring this a little bit more on the channel. We're going to do a bit of a deep research dive into like, how do we really lighten that mental load? How does it impact people with ADHD? But I think this was a really, really important conversation, a good place to start. And if you'd like to hear more conversations like this, check out the ADHD Aha podcast. We'll link to it in the description below. Thank you so much for being here, Laura. This was so valuable. I knew that it was hard to have a heavy mental load, but it didn't occur to me that the emotion dysregulation piece was also a factor in it. And that was game-changing for me. So thank you for that. Thank you for all the insights you've brought.
Thank you so much for having me, for coming on the show. And it's so funny to hear you thank me for that, Jessica, because I feel like I learned so much of this from you. So thank you.
Thank you to my brain advocates and all my Patreon brains for supporting the channel, allowing us to do things like this. Thank you to understood.org for sponsoring this video.
Yes, and brains, don't forget to check out Jessica's interview on ADHD Aha too.
You called them brains. Like, subscribe, click all the things, and we'll see you next video.
Bye brains.